4 astronauts, a spacecraft built from scratch, and a mission that will take humans further from Earth than anyone has gone since 1972. This is Artemis 2, and it is not just a space mission. It is the moment humanity remembers what it means to reach for something beyond itself. But to understand why this launch matters so much, we need to go back to the last time we actually did this. December 1972. Eugene Cernan climbs back into the lunar module on the surface of the moon. He takes one last look at the horizon. Then he pulls himself through the hatch. And just like that, humans leave the moon. Nobody knew it would be the last time for over half a century. The Apollo program ended not because we ran out of capability. It ended because we ran out of political will. The space race had been won. The cameras moved on. And the greatest adventure in human history was quietly shelved. For 54 years, no human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The International Space Station sits roughly 400 kilometers above the surface. That sounds far. But in cosmic terms, it is nothing. It is barely a scratch above the atmosphere. The moon is 384,000 kilometers away. We have not been back since Cernan closed that hatch. Until now. Artemis 2 is the second mission in NASA's Artemis program. And while Artemis 1 sent an uncrewed Orion capsule around the moon and back in 2022, Artemis 2 will do something that has not happened in the lifetime of most people alive today. It will put 4 human beings inside a spacecraft and fly them around the moon. No landing, not yet. But the crew will travel approximately 9,000 kilometers beyond the far side of the moon at their farthest point, further than any human in history has ever been from Earth. Let that distance sit for a moment. 9,000 kilometers past the moon. When they reach that point, they will be looking back at a planet so small it could be covered by a human thumb, and they will be completely alone out there. So who are the 4 people willing to climb inside a rocket and go further into space than anyone has gone in more than half a century? Let's start with the commander, Reed Wiseman. Wiseman is a former Navy test pilot and NASA astronaut who logged 165 days in space aboard the International Space Station back in 2014. He spent years as the chief of NASA's astronaut office before being selected to lead this crew. He is methodical. He is experienced, and he understands better than almost anyone what the pressure of this mission actually means. Because Wiseman is not just flying a spacecraft, he is commanding the first crewed deep space mission since Apollo 17. Every decision he makes will be made further from help than any commander since Cernan himself. Next is the pilot, Victor Glover. Glover is also a Navy test pilot and a veteran of the International Space Station. He spent nearly 6 months aboard the ISS in 2020 and 2021. He was the first black astronaut to serve on a long-duration ISS mission. And now he will become one of the first black astronauts to travel to the moon. History tends to stack up quietly around Victor Glover. Then there is mission specialist Christina Koch. Koch holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman. She spent 328 days continuously in space aboard the ISS, setting a record that still stands. She's a research engineer with a background in physics and electrical engineering. She is meticulous. She is calm under pressure. And she will become the first woman in history to travel to the moon. Think about that for a second. Human beings have been going to space since 1961. Men walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. And in all that time, no woman has ever traveled beyond Earth orbit. Christina Koch will be the first. And finally, mission specialist Jeremy Hansen. Hansen is a Canadian astronaut and a Royal Canadian Air Force fighter pilot. He has never flown in space before. This will be his first mission, which makes Artemis 2 a remarkable and slightly terrifying debut, because his first spaceflight will take him further from Earth than virtually any human being who has ever lived. No pressure. Together, these 4 people represent something genuinely new. A crew that looks different from the Apollo crews. A mission that carries the weight of everything Apollo was, and everything it never got to be. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because Artemis 2 almost did not happen this way. The Artemis program has been plagued by delays, cost overruns, technical problems, political headwinds, and genuine engineering challenges that pushed the original timeline years behind schedule. The Space Launch System, NASA's massive new rocket, took well over a decade to develop. It has been criticized relentlessly for burning through tens of billions of dollars. Some in the aerospace world argued it was outdated before it even launched. Others pointed to the success of Artemis 1 and said it proved the critics wrong. The truth sits somewhere in between. What is not debatable is what Artemis 1 showed the world in November 2022. The SLS launched from Kennedy Space Center at 1:47 in the morning. It carried the uncrewed Orion capsule on a 25-day journey around the Moon. Orion traveled 4,200 kilometers from Earth at its furthest point. It survived re-entry at speeds of around 39,000 kilometers per hour, and it splashed down in the Pacific Ocean almost exactly where mission planners had predicted. It worked. The heat shield survived. The systems survived. And NASA had the data it needed to say, "We are ready to put people inside this thing." But there was one problem: the heat shield. During Artemis 1 re-entry, the Orion heat shield experienced unexpected erosion. Material charred away in patterns that engineers had not predicted. It did not cause a catastrophic failure. The capsule survived. But when NASA engineers dug into the data, they realized they did not fully understand why it happened. And you cannot put 4 humans in a spacecraft when you do not fully understand your heat shield. This discovery pushed Artemis 2 back significantly. Engineers ran simulations. They analyzed the ablative material layer by layer. They adjusted re-entry parameters. They studied what had gone wrong and whether it could be corrected without a full redesign. Eventually, NASA made a decision. The erosion was understood well enough. The re-entry profile could be adjusted to reduce the stress on the heat shield. The mission could proceed. But it was a reminder that space exploration does not move on political timelines. It moves on physics. And physics does not care about press releases. So what will actually happen during Artemis 2? The mission plan runs roughly 10 days. Here is how it breaks down. The crew will board Orion at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Space Launch System will ignite with 8.8 million pounds of thrust, making it the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. Within minutes, the SLS will push Orion into low Earth orbit. This first phase is familiar territory. But then comes the moment that separates Artemis 2 from anything since Apollo. The upper stage of the rocket will fire again. The translunar injection burn, and Orion will leave Earth orbit. Not just leave low Earth orbit. Leave Earth orbit entirely. The spacecraft will accelerate away from the planet on a trajectory toward the Moon. And as it does, 4 human beings will cross a threshold that no one has crossed since December 1972. They will become the furthest humans from Earth since Eugene Cernan and the Apollo 17 crew. And then they will keep going. The mission profile takes Orion around the Moon on a trajectory called a free return. This is important. A free return trajectory means that if something goes wrong, if an engine fails, the laws of orbital mechanics will still bring the spacecraft back to Earth without requiring a successful burn. Gravity does the work. Apollo 13 used a free return trajectory to save its crew after an oxygen tank exploded in 1970. NASA learned that lesson well. Artemis 2 builds it into the plan from day 1. At their farthest point, the crew will be roughly 9,000 kilometers past the far side of the Moon. They will be more than 38,000 kilometers from home. And in that moment, they will hold a record that has stood unchallenged for over 5 decades. Then they will come home. The return journey takes several days. Orion will re-enter Earth's atmosphere at extreme speed. The heat shield will face temperatures around 2760 degrees Celsius. And if everything goes right, 4 astronauts will splash down in the Pacific Ocean and be pulled out of the water by recovery teams. 10 days, 4 people, one shot at history. But here is what most mission coverage gets wrong about Artemis 2. People talk about it as a test flight, a precursor, a stepping stone toward the real mission, which is Artemis 3, the actual moon landing. And that framing is technically accurate. NASA describes Artemis 2 as a crude flight test, but calling it just a test flight sells it short in a way that would have felt absurd in 1968. Apollo 8 was also described as a test mission. The plan was to test the command module in deep space. And yes, it was a test. But it was also the first time humans left Earth orbit. The first time people saw the full disk of the Earth from deep space. The first time anyone photographed Earthrise. A photo that arguably changed how the human race thought about its own planet. Frank Borman read from the Book of Genesis on Christmas Eve while orbiting the moon. 300 million people listened. That was a test flight. Artemis 2 carries the same weight. Whatever happens after it, whatever Artemis 3 and 4 and the eventual lunar gateway become, Artemis 2 will always be the mission that ended a 54-year absence. The mission that sent humans back to the moon's neighborhood for the first time since the 1970s. Christina Koch will become the first woman to travel there. Jeremy Hansen will become the first Canadian. And all 4 of them will look out those windows at a moon that humans have photographed and mapped and dreamed about for generations. And they will see it the way only 24 people in all of history have ever seen it. With nothing between them and it but empty space. Now let's talk about what is really at stake here. Because Artemis is not just about flags and footprints. NASA's stated goal is to establish a sustained human presence on and around the moon. Not visits. Presence. The Lunar Gateway, a small space station in lunar orbit, is planned as a waypoint for future missions. The south pole of the moon contains water ice in permanently shadowed craters. That water ice can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. Rocket fuel. The moon could become a refueling depot for missions going further into the solar system. And then there is the bigger picture. Everything happening with Artemis is a proving ground for Mars. The deep space life support systems. The long-duration spaceflight medicine. The communication delays and crew autonomy. The radiation exposure outside Earth's magnetic field. All of it feeds into the eventual question of whether human beings can travel to another planet. Artemis 2 will expose its crew to radiation levels significantly higher than anything experienced on the International Space Station. Orion's structure provides some shielding. But beyond Earth's magnetosphere, the crew will face solar particle events and galactic cosmic rays in ways that ISS crews never do. Scientists will study exactly how much radiation they absorb, how their bodies respond, what long-term risks exist, and those findings will shape every Mars mission plan that follows. So when you watch Artemis 2 launch, you are not just watching 4 people fly to the moon and back. You are watching the species figure out whether it can survive the journey to Mars. There is another dimension to this story that does not always make the headlines. Artemis is launching during a moment of genuine competition in space. China has announced plans to land taikonauts on the moon before 2030. The Chinese National Space Administration has moved steadily and deliberately through its lunar program. Chang'e robotic missions have landed on the far side of the moon. Sample return missions have brought back lunar material. And the stated goal is a crewed landing. For the first time since the original space race, the United States is not the only major power with serious lunar ambitions. NASA officials are careful about how they talk about this publicly. Space exploration framed as a race tends to create bad decisions. Apollo 1 killed 3 astronauts partly because political pressure pushed NASA to move faster than safety warranted. But the competitive context is real, and it has accelerated congressional support for Artemis funding in ways that purely scientific arguments sometimes struggle to achieve. Whatever the motivation, the result is that the moon is becoming relevant again in ways it has not been since the 1970s. Let's go back for a moment to the humans at the center of this. Reed Wiseman will be strapped into the commander's seat during launch, knowing that the pressure to succeed goes beyond his crew. A failure of Artemis 2 would set the entire program back years, possibly permanently. The political consensus that currently supports NASA's lunar ambitions is not guaranteed to last. Victor Glover will watch Earth shrink in the window knowing that he carries something heavier than a mission patch. He is a symbol whether he wants to be or not, and he has spoken openly about what it means to be part of a crew that looks different from every Apollo crew that came before. Christina Koch has spent more continuous time in space than any woman in history. She has floated in microgravity for nearly a year of her life, and yet nothing she has done has taken her more than 400 kilometers from Earth. Artemis 2 will take her almost 1,000 times further. Jeremy Hansen will experience his first launch, his first orbital insertion, and his first view of Earth from deep space all on the same mission. He has trained for years for a moment that most astronauts never get. A moment that most human beings cannot even fully imagine. 4 people. 4 stories. 1 trajectory around the moon. There is a quieter thread running through all of this that is worth sitting with. When Apollo ended in 1972, the assumption was that we would be back soon. Nobody really believed it would take 50 years. The space shuttle was supposed to make access to space routine. Space stations were supposed to be stepping stones. Lunar bases were discussed seriously in the 1970s as near-term possibilities. None of it happened on anything like the predicted timeline. And so the question that Artemis raises is not just, can we go back to the moon? The question is, can we sustain it? Can we build something that outlasts individual administrations and budget cycles and shifting public attention? The Apollo program lasted roughly a decade at peak intensity. Then it was gone. The infrastructure was dismantled. The expertise was lost. NASA spent the following decades rebuilding capabilities that had once existed and then been allowed to decay. Artemis is NASA's attempt to not make that mistake again. Whether it succeeds depends on choices that extend far beyond the engineering. It depends on whether the political will holds. Whether international partnerships with Canada and Japan and the European Space Agency create enough shared investment to outlast any single government's priorities. Whether commercial partners like SpaceX, which is developing the human landing system for Artemis 3, can deliver reliable hardware on workable timelines. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of ways it could stall. But right now, in this moment, 4 human beings are preparing to climb inside a spacecraft and travel further from Earth than anyone has gone since 1972. That is real. That is happening. The night before a major space launch has a specific quality to it that people who have witnessed one describe in similar ways. There is a stillness around the launch pad. The rocket stands illuminated against a dark sky. Technicians who have spent years building and testing and verifying every system will hand it over. Their work is done. Whatever happens next is physics. The crew goes through final medical checks, final suit checks, final briefings. They eat breakfast. They ride the transport out to the pad. They take an elevator to the top of the launch tower. They strap in. And then they wait. The countdown is not dramatic in the way movies portray it. It is methodical. It is filled with holds and checks and verifications. Launch controllers run through procedures that have been rehearsed hundreds of times. And then the final seconds tick down. And 8.8 million pounds of thrust ignite beneath 4 human beings who have decided that going to the edge of the known world, and maybe a little past it, is worth the risk. 54 years is a long time. A child born the year Apollo 17 left the moon is now in their mid-50s. Multiple entire generations have lived their whole lives in a world where humans do not go to the moon. Where the furthest any person ventures from Earth is the space station visible on a clear night as a moving dot of light. Artemis 2 will change that. And when it does, when those 4 astronauts swing around the far side of the moon and lose contact with Earth for those minutes when the moon blocks all radio signals, they will be more alone than any human beings alive. On the other side of that silence, they will re-establish contact. Mission controllers will hear their voices, and humanity will have gone further again. Not to stay, not yet, but far enough to remember what it felt like. Far enough to start believing that the rest of it is possible. Whatever your feelings about space exploration, whatever your views on whether the money could be better spent, there is something worth pausing on here. For the entirety of recorded human history, people have looked up at the moon and wondered. For 1 decade, one extraordinary compressed decade from 1969 to 1972, 12 people actually stood on it. They picked up rocks. They drove buggies across the surface. They hit golf balls. They called home. And then they left, and nobody went back. For 54 years, the moon has been something we look at again, something we photograph with better telescopes, something we send robots to examine. Artemis 2 will not land, but it will put human eyes close enough to see the surface in detail that no camera fully captures, close enough to feel the reality of it in a way that data cannot convey. Reed Wiseman will look at the moon from 9,000 kilometers past it and see something that only 24 people have ever seen. Christina Koch will look out that window and be the first woman in history to be that close. And somewhere back on Earth, a kid who has never seen a human being go further than the space station will watch a live stream on their phone and see something that changes what they think is possible. That is what Artemis 2 is. That is why it matters. The humans are leaving Earth orbit again, for the first time in 54 years. And where they go from there is entirely up to us.